It was on a Saturday morning in late September that the quiet pulse of St. Mary Mead was disturbed by something so slight, so seemingly ordinary, that it might have passed unnoticed by anyone but Miss Jane Marple. The postman, cheerful as ever, had delivered a small envelope to Mrs. Lillian Price at Rosewood Cottage. A plain thing, unremarkable, save for the single old coin tucked inside. A silver shilling, polished to brightness, and the short note folded neatly beside it. "Echo returns," the note said. By lunchtime, the story of the mysterious letter had made its discreet rounds through the village, from the grocer's counter to the postmistress's window, and finally to the vicarage, where Mrs. Bantry was already having her second cup of tea with Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry relayed it with relish, her voice dropping to that confidential pitch reserved for the most delightful morsels of scandal. "Imagine, Jane, just a coin and 2 words. Lillian's beside herself. Says it must be from that dreadful Mr. Keating, the one who ran off years ago with her sister's savings." Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes on the rim of her teacup. "People seldom send tokens of memory without reason, dear Dolly. A coin, you say? It rather suggests repayment, or guilt." But by evening, gossip had turned to horror. Lillian Price was found dead in her sitting room, the same silver coin resting on the table beside her cooling teacup. No sign of struggle, no forced entry. Just the faint smell of violets. The clock stopped at 6:40, and the window slightly open to the sound of the church bell echoing from across the green. Inspector Cray arrived from Much Benham before dark, full of brisk certainty and official importance. "Natural causes, most likely," he declared after his first glance. "Heart failure. These village ladies work themselves into a fright over nothing." Miss Marple said nothing at all. She stood by the fireplace, hands folded, studying the faint pattern of dust disturbed beneath the chair. The maid, a timid girl of 19, had been the one to find her mistress. She insisted she had heard something fall, like a coin hitting the floor, before discovering the body. When Cray left to send for the coroner, Miss Marple turned back toward the window, her eyes soft but thoughtful. "Echo returns," she murmured under her breath. But what was it that echoed? The past, or the truth? Outside, the evening deepened into stillness. Somewhere across the green, the faint laughter of children drifted through the mist. Yet beneath it all, St. Mary Mead held its breath. For something unseen had stirred in its peaceful heart, and Miss Marple had already heard its first whisper. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was alive with murmurs. What had begun as a curious tale of a letter and a coin had turned, overnight, into a whispered legend of murder. In the high street, behind the glass jars of barley sugar and mint, humbugs, Mrs. Finch the shopkeeper told anyone who'd listen that poor Lillian Price had been as good as poisoned by her own nerves. The postmistress disagreed. She'd seen the letter herself, or so she claimed, and insisted it was the doing of that man Keating come back at last. By noon, even the vicar's wife had taken to warning her housemaid to lock the windows before dusk. Miss Marple, however, had spent her morning quite differently. She walked slowly through the village, her parasol tapping the gravel, her blue eyes lingering on things that others might pass without notice. The faint wheel marks by Rosewood's gate, the neglected rose bush trimmed too recently, the curious absence of any letters still on Lillian's table. She stopped by the front garden where Inspector Cray was giving his report to Sergeant Best, both men standing awkwardly in the damp grass. Cray looked up with the polite impatience of a man humoring an elderly observer. "All quite straightforward, Miss Marple," he said with a tight smile. "Dr. Simmons confirmed the heart gave out. Poor woman frightened herself to death, I should think. We'll have the official report tomorrow." Miss Marple nodded gently, her gaze steady on the window sill. "And the coin?" she asked. "Still on the table. Odd little trinket, but nothing to it. We'll return it to the estate after the paperwork's done." She inclined her head slightly. Sometimes, Inspector, it's the small things that are meant to be seen. The rest are carefully hidden." He laughed lightly and turned away, already weary of her quiet certainty. Miss Marple stayed behind a moment longer, studying the window latch. There was a faint scrape on the inner side, as though it had been prized open gently from within, not forced. Inside the parlor, the maid knelt by a basket of linen, pale and trembling. Miss Marple asked, in her softest tone, whether her mistress had any callers that day. "No one, miss," the girl whispered. "Only the postman, and a gentleman in a dark coat what came after tea. I didn't see his face proper. He stood by the hedge." "And did he speak?" The girl shook her head. "Only waited a bit, then walked off toward the church." Outside, the bell rang for the midday service, its echo carrying across the fields. The same echo, Miss Marple thought, that Lillian must have heard through that half-open window not 24 hours before. That afternoon, she took tea with Mrs. Bantry again, who was eager to supply her own version of events. "Everyone's saying it was the shock of seeing that man again. I told Colonel Bantry as much over breakfast, but he says it's nonsense. Keating's been abroad for years. Still, there's something frightfully odd about that coin, don't you think? A message of sorts." Miss Marple stirred her cup slowly. "Yes, dear, a message, but not from the sender, one imagines." The next day's newspaper reported Lillian Price's death as sudden heart failure. But in the quiet of her cottage that evening, Miss Marple sat before her window, the fire low, her knitting untouched. She wrote 3 names on a scrap of paper: Keating, Simmons, Finch, and beside each, a single small note: motive unknown. Then she drew a faint circle round the word echo. She smiled to herself, a quiet, knowing smile. "People are never content to let the past rest," she murmured. "It always finds a way to speak again." And as she folded the paper neatly into her sewing basket, the first autumn wind passed through the lane outside, carrying with it the faint rattle of something metallic, a sound not unlike a coin rolling across stone. The following morning broke with a thin mist that clung to the hedgerows and softened the church spire into a ghostly silhouette. Miss Marple, who rose earlier than most, was already at her window, watching the slow awakening of St. Mary Mead. There was something about quiet mornings, she thought, that allowed one to hear what the world tried so hard to conceal. By 8 o'clock, she had made up her mind to visit the vicarage, not for gossip, but for observation. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, always managed to know who was simply beside themselves after a tragedy, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that people's fears often revealed more truth than their statements. Mrs. Clement received her with that air of brisk sympathy peculiar to kind-hearted women who adored the comfort of shared sorrow. The kettle sang on the stove, and her voice lowered to a whisper, as though walls themselves might betray her confidences. "Such a dreadful business, Jane. Poor Lillian, gone like that, and would you believe Mrs. Finch saw a man standing at the crossroads last night? Dark coat, hat pulled down. She swears he looked toward Rosewood Cottage before disappearing up the lane." Miss Marple sipped her tea without comment, letting the words sink like pebbles into still water. "Curious," she murmured at last, "especially as no one seemed to think Lillian received visitors. And yet this man is seen twice now, near her home." "Twice?" Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "The maid mentioned him the evening before," Miss Marple said gently, her gaze drifting toward the lace curtains. "It seems the dead are not the only ones haunting Rosewood Cottage." By midday, she had walked down to the post office, where Mrs. Finch was already recounting her sighting for the 5th time. The woman's eyes were bright with excitement, her fingers tapping the counter as she relived the moment. "I know what I saw, Miss Marple. Tall fellow, walking with purpose, not local, that's certain, and something shining in his hand. Could have been a coin." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice mild. "Or perhaps a key, Mrs. Finch. It's easy to mistake reflections in poor light. "Oh, no, Miss Marple," the woman insisted. "Coin, I'd swear to it. The way it caught the lamplight, like a signal." The word lingered. A signal. It nestled somewhere deep in Miss Marple's mind, aligning itself beside that curious note. Echo returns. She thanked Mrs. Finch politely and made her way back through the lane, her walking stick clicking softly against the cobblestones. That evening, Inspector Cray arrived at the vicarage with the final coroner's report. "Natural causes confirmed," he announced, his tone confident but weary. "No poison, no trauma. Simple heart failure brought on by shock." He looked almost triumphant, as though the dead woman's heart had neatly spared him a week of paperwork. Miss Marple, who had been quietly arranging a tray of teacups, spoke without turning. "And the letter, Inspector, was it examined for fingerprints?" Cray gave a dismissive chuckle. "We did glance over it. Only hers, Miss Marple. Nothing to indicate foul play." "Indeed," she said softly, as though to herself. "And yet, one might think that a message sent in such a deliberate manner would carry some intention beyond fright. A warning, perhaps, or a memory resurrected." Cray frowned. "You believe it means something?" "I believe," she replied, her eyes distant, "that people rarely choose symbols by accident. Coins, echoes, hearts, they're all reminders of what's been lost or what one hopes to regain." When the inspector had gone, the vicar's clock chimed 6, and the sound lingered in the air, faint and hollow. Miss Marple stood by the window again, watching the fog roll over the village green. Beneath it, a solitary figure passed by, slowly, almost stealthily, before vanishing down the lane that led to Rosewood Cottage. For the first time, Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She drew the curtains and sat by the fire, her knitting untouched, her thoughts circling back to that single word written in her neat, steady hand. Echo. It had begun to sound less like a message and more like a promise. The next morning dawned pale and soundless, the mist still clinging low across the meadows like something reluctant to let go. Miss Marple had not slept well. All night, her mind had circled quietly around that word, echo, and the shape it took in the lives of those who remained. In St. Mary Mead, nothing ever happened without a cause, no matter how small or hidden. And if there was one thing she understood better than the police ever would, it was that human beings rarely acted out of mystery. They acted out of habit, memory, or pain. By 8:30, she was already walking toward the churchyard path that bordered Rosewood Cottage. The house stood empty now, shutters drawn, its garden disturbed only by the soft scraping of the constable's boots as he finished sealing the gate. The autumn air smelled faintly of damp earth and rose petals that refused to die. Miss Marple lingered a moment by the fence, her eyes drawn to the ground near the step where the gravel looked uneven. Kneeling slightly, she noticed something glinting between the pebbles. A small button, black, round, polished smooth by use. Not a woman's button, certainly. She turned it over delicately in her glove, the sort of thing a man might wear on an overcoat. She slipped it quietly into her handkerchief before anyone noticed, then walked on toward the high street. At the post office, Mrs. Finch was once again in full command of the morning's discussion. "I heard," she was telling Mrs. Price from the dairy, "that the inspector means to close the matter, says it was shock. But shock of what, I ask you? That's what no one's saying. And that strange man vanished as quick as he came." Miss Marple entered softly. Her presence met with a flutter of curiosity. "You've all been most observant," she said mildly. "A pity more official minds are not so diligent. And tell me, Mrs. Finch, when you saw this man, did he happen to limp?" "Limp?" The woman blinked. "Why, yes. Come to think, he favored his left leg a bit. I thought it was the slope of the road." Miss Marple nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "How interesting." Later, as she made her way back, she met Dr. Simmons outside his surgery, locking up before his round. He looked tired, his brow creased with something between worry and irritation. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard all the nonsense in the village. Poor Lillian. Heart gave out, plain and simple. Some people won't rest until they turn sorrow into scandal." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "And yet," she said, "you'd agree it's unusual for a heart to fail at precisely the moment someone sends a coin from the past." He gave a short laugh, uncomfortable. "You've a mind for drama, Miss Marple. Best leave these matters to the living." She watched him go, his limp just perceptible as he stepped off the curb. When he turned the corner, she opened her handkerchief again, gazing at the black button nestled inside. The very same kind, she was almost certain, that adorned Dr. Simmons' overcoat. That evening, she sat by her window as the rain began to fall in a steady rhythm, each drop merging into the next like the slow ticking of a memory long ignored. The lamplight shone across her table, where 3 objects lay side by side: the coin, the button, and the note she'd copied from Lillian's letter. Echo returns. It was then she noticed what had been troubling her from the beginning. The note's handwriting was precise, slanted, and unmistakably firm. It was not written by a man's hand, but a woman's. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the faintest shadow of comprehension flickering in her eyes. "Echo returns," she murmured again, but perhaps not the echo of guilt, the echo of revenge. Outside, the wind carried the church bell's distant toll across the green, and she felt, for the first time, that the village was holding something close, something it wasn't yet ready to confess. The rain did not let up through the night, and by morning, St. Mary Mead had the washed, uneasy look of a village that had seen too much and understood too little. Puddles gathered in the cobbled lanes, and the smell of wet leaves hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple moved quietly about her cottage, tidying her breakfast things with an absent precision. Her thoughts were no longer scattered. They were beginning at last to take shape. The coin, the letter, the button, the limp. Each one fit into something larger, though the outline of it was still faint, like a photograph slowly developing in a tray. Just before noon, a sharp knock came at her door. It was Inspector Cray, coat damp, hat pulled low. He entered with the air of a man burdened by a problem he'd rather not have. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought I'd best call in. Dr. Simmons insists you've been poking about, and I'd rather hear your notions directly than second-hand." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, pouring him tea with unhurried grace. "I should hate to cause trouble for anyone, Inspector, but since you ask, I think poor Lillian's death was not quite the quiet matter it appears." He sighed. "If you mean that nonsense about coins and ghosts, the coroner's been clear. Natural causes. End of story." "Natural, yes," she said softly, "but not unassisted." Cray raised an eyebrow. "Unassisted." She folded her hands neatly. "Fear can be induced, Inspector. A heart need not be touched to be stopped." He frowned. "You're suggesting someone frightened her deliberately?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied gently, "that someone wanted her frightened enough to die. And that person understood her past far too well." The inspector leaned back, the skepticism fading slightly beneath the quiet certainty of her tone. "You've something to back that up?" She reached into a drawer and produced the button, laid delicately on the saucer beside his cup. "Found just outside her garden gate. I believe it belongs to Dr. Simmons' overcoat. He was one of the last to see her alive, was he not?" Cray scowled. "The doctor. He's been here 20 years. Trusted man, hardly the sort." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. "Oh, I quite agree. He is trusted, which makes it so much easier for him to walk where others cannot." The inspector left soon after, uneasy but too proud to admit she had unsettled him. As his footsteps faded down the lane, Miss Marple turned toward the window once more. The rain had thinned to a drizzle, and through the wavering glass she saw Mrs. Bantry hurrying across the green with her umbrella tilted askew. Moments later, there came another knock. "Jane!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed breathlessly as she entered. "You'll never believe it. Simmons has gone to Much Benham. Says he's consulting about an inheritance matter, but, oh, the village is in an uproar. They say Lillian's will is missing." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet comprehension. "Missing, you say? How very prompt of fate." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "And that maid, the Price girl, she's been seen talking to the solicitor's clerk behind the grocer's. Something about a letter that was never posted." Miss Marple took this in with the faintest nod. "The dead are seldom silent, Dolly. They speak through the living, though not always intentionally." That evening, after Mrs. Bantry had gone and the cottage was still, Miss Marple set a single candle on her writing desk and opened her notebook. In her tidy script, she wrote 3 new lines beneath her earlier notes. Button, Dr. Simmons, fear or guilt. Maid, letter withheld. Why? Will, missing, motive. She paused, pen hovering, then added one more thought in the margin. Echo. Lillian, not first. The candle flame trembled as a gust of wind brushed against the window pane. Miss Marple's eyes lifted, their pale blue depth unreadable. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once, its sound lingering over the village like a question waiting to be answered. The candle burned low as Miss Marple sat still, her pen resting against the paper. The faint crackle from the hearth was the only sound that dared disturb the silence. She had spent most of the night considering one question: why had Lillian Price's will vanished so quickly, and who stood to gain by its disappearance? The human heart, Miss Marple often mused, had a curious way of revealing itself, not through what it proclaimed, but through what it tried hardest to conceal. The next morning brought a pale sun and a certain tension that seemed to ripple through the village. People no longer lingered to talk outside the grocer's. They whispered instead. Inspector Cray had returned from Much Benham with news that the doctor's trip had been shorter than expected. Simmons came back early, Mrs. Bantry reported over tea. Apparently the solicitor wasn't even in. He said it was a waste of time. Rather odd, don't you think? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, though her eyes were far away. "Odd," she said gently, "is a word that covers a multitude of sins." By afternoon, she decided to call upon the maid, Elsie. The girl had returned to her aunt's small cottage near the old mill, and Miss Marple found her sitting at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly around a chipped mug. She looked pale and nervous, like someone who feared her own words. "Elsie, my dear," Miss Marple began, her voice kind but probing, "I wonder if you might tell me about the letter you didn't post." The girl's eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. "I didn't mean any harm, ma'am. Truly I didn't. It was just Mrs. Price told me not to. She said it was to be delivered by hand." "To whom?" "I don't know," Elsie whispered. "But she was frightened when she wrote it. Kept looking at the window, said something about an echo that needed to stop." Miss Marple felt the faintest tightening in her chest. "And what happened to the letter after that?" The girl hesitated, then opened the drawer beside her. From within she drew a folded sheet of paper, still sealed but marked faintly with the impression of a shilling coin pressed into the wax. Miss Marple turned it over, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've kept this safe, haven't you?" Elsie nodded tearfully. "I didn't know what to do. I thought the police would say I'd stolen it." "On the contrary, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, slipping the letter into her reticule. "You've done something very right indeed." That evening, as the light faded from the fields, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, the sealed letter before her. The wax was brittle, easily broken, and yet she hesitated. In every village crime she had ever known, there was a moment, a quiet, trembling point, when curiosity crossed into revelation, and one could never turn back. She broke the seal. The letter was short, written in the same careful hand as the note that had come with the coin. "If you read this, it means the past has found you. There can be no peace until the debt is settled. You will know who I am when the echo returns." Miss Marple folded it again, her fingers steady though her pulse quickened. It was not addressed to anyone. No name, no signature, but the phrasing, the delicate, almost genteel menace of it, spoke volumes. It was not written by a vengeful man. It was written by a woman accustomed to being polite even while she threatened destruction. As she sat there, a carriage wheel creaked faintly outside, followed by a firm knock at the door. She rose and opened it to find Inspector Cray standing in the glow of his lantern. His expression was grave. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "Dr. Simmons has been found dead. At his desk. Looks like poison." Miss Marple did not startle. She only looked past him into the dark lane where the mist gathered once more, as though the village itself were holding its breath. "Then," she said softly, "the echo has truly returned." The night of Dr. Simmons' death spread unease through St. Mary Mead like a slow, creeping fog. Word traveled faster than the constable could quiet it. Lights burned late behind curtained windows, and even the stout-hearted Mrs. Bantry confessed to sleeping with the lamp on. 2 deaths in 3 days had turned the village's rhythm brittle. Beneath every polite greeting at the grocer's or the post office lingered the same question no one dared voice aloud: who would be next? Inspector Cray looked 10 years older when Miss Marple found him at the doctor's surgery the following morning. The smell of carbolic still hung in the air, sharp and clean, unable to disguise the faint trace of something sweeter. Almond oil, she noted. He stood beside the desk, arms folded, his expression dour. "Laudanum overdose," he muttered. "Bottle open on the table, note beside it. Says, I could not bear it any longer, clear as day." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the room, resting on the overturned ink bottle, the chair slightly askew, the cup half full of water. "And yet," she said quietly, "the good doctor was left-handed. This note is written by a right." Cray looked at her sharply. "You're certain?" "Quite," she replied. He always held his pen with his left thumb crooked oddly upward, a habit one doesn't unlearn even in despair. The inspector ran a hand through his thinning hair. "So you think it's murder again? God help us." Miss Marple said nothing at first. Her gaze had fixed on the edge of the desk where a small round stain darkened the wood. She touched it lightly. It smelled faintly metallic, faintly of coin. The doctor's own shilling, perhaps, or another message. By midday, the story of his suicide was already circulating, embroidered with every sort of speculation. Mrs. Finch claimed he'd been blackmailed. Mrs. Clement whispered of a secret patient. And Mrs. Bantry, of course, maintained that he'd been tormented by guilt over poor Lillian. Miss Marple spent the afternoon walking through the village, her mind weaving the scattered threads together. 2 people dead, both connected by an unseen line. The coin, the letter, the echo. Each had received a warning of some kind, subtle enough to pass as coincidence, but cruel enough to stir old fear. She could feel it now, pulsing beneath the calm of the hedgerows and cottages. An old wound reopened, carefully, by someone who knew exactly where to press. That evening, she returned to Rosewood Cottage under the pretext of fetching her shawl left behind during her first visit. The constable, young and easily flustered, let her pass. Inside, the air had grown stale. Dust had begun to settle on the table where the coin once lay. She opened a drawer by instinct, Lillian's correspondence neatly bound with a ribbon. One envelope caught her eye. The return address had faded, but the name remained legible. Margaret Price, London. Lillian's sister. Miss Marple stood very still. Margaret had died nearly 15 years ago, if she recalled correctly. Her name mentioned once in passing at a church fete, but the handwriting on the envelope was the same as that on the note found with the coin. She left the cottage quietly, heart beating faster than she cared to admit, and walked back through the mist, her shawl drawn tight. The clock struck 9 as she reached her gate, and there, resting on her doorstep, lay a small brown parcel. No address, no stamp. Inside was a single silver shilling, bright as moonlight, and a slip of paper. "Echo returns," it said again. Miss Marple folded. The note, her expression unreadable. "Oh," she murmured to herself. "So it's me, now." The kettle began to whistle softly behind her, and she moved toward it with unhurried calm. But in her eyes, beneath that familiar kindness, there flickered a light of sharp, cold intelligence. The game, at last, had turned her way. The shilling lay on Miss Marple's table like a dare. Its surface caught the lamplight with quiet insolence, spinning faint reflections across her teacup. For a long while, she merely regarded it, her expression thoughtful but still. Whoever had left it knew her habits, her evening walks, the hour she boiled her water, even which gate latch creaked least loudly. That precision spoke not of menace alone, but of familiarity. Someone close, someone watching. When the knock came, she did not startle. She simply looked up and said, "Do come in, Inspector." Cray stepped through the doorway, hat dripping, eyes drawn to the table. "You've heard, then," he said grimly. "Word's out. Another coin's turned up." "Yes," she replied softly. "This one." He froze, staring. "Good Lord, at your house." "Delivered neatly," she said, "and left without fear of being seen, which suggests confidence or innocence. Perhaps both." Cray rubbed his temple, muttering under his breath. "This is spiraling beyond sense. 2 dead, and now threats against you. I'll post a man here tonight." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "That won't be necessary. Whoever is behind this doesn't work in the open. They depend upon the village's quiet. It's trust, it's blindness. A constable would only frighten the mice, not the cat." The inspector frowned, uneasy. "You've an idea who the cat is, then?" "I have a suspicion," she said, "but it's still hiding behind the curtains of the past. Tell me, Inspector, did the doctor ever mention Margaret Price?" He blinked. "Her sister? No, never heard of her." "Why?" "Because she's the one who wrote both letters," Miss Marple murmured, lifting the first folded note. "The hand is identical, yet Margaret's been dead for 15 years. Cray let out a low whistle. "Then who's writing in her name?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely the echo we've been hearing." After he left, the night drew in around the cottage like a living thing. Miss Marple sat by the window, lights dimmed, watching the lane. Every movement, every rustle of leaf against glass carried meaning now. She thought of the doctor's limp, the maid's fear, Lillian's trembling hand when she'd written her final message. Fear connected them all, like beads strung on a single wire. But who had plucked that wire to make it sing? A sound broke her reverie, a faint scuff of gravel just beyond the hedge. She rose without haste, crossed the room, and drew the curtain back an inch. There, beneath the lamplight, stood Elsie, the maid. Her face was pale, rain-darkened, her hands gripping a folded paper. Miss Marple opened the door before the girl could knock. "Come in, my dear. You're shaking." Elsie stepped inside, trembling from cold and fear alike. I didn't know where else to go, ma'am. I found this in the doctor's desk this afternoon while they were clearing things. It had your name on it." Miss Marple took the envelope carefully. The writing was the same delicate, slanted script. Margaret Price's hand again. She unfolded it slowly. "You see too much, Miss Marple. The past belongs to those who survived it. Leave the dead their secrets." The older woman looked up from the page, her expression calm but her eyes bright with a quiet flame. "Did anyone say you take this?" "No, ma'am," the girl whispered. "I swear it." "Good," Miss Marple said, folding the letter once more. "Then no one must know you are here. You'll go home by the back path. Lock your door, keep your lamp low, and Whatever you do, do not open it for a knock after midnight." Elsie nodded, frightened but trusting, and slipped into the dark. When the door closed, Miss Marple remained standing in the quiet room, the letter pressed between her fingers. The rain had stopped. In its place was a silence so complete it felt deliberate. She crossed to the desk, drew out her notebook, and wrote one final line beneath her list of clues. "The dead write only when the living lend them their hand." Her lips curved faintly, almost sadly. "And I think," she whispered to the empty room, "I've just seen whose hand it is." Miss Marple did not sleep that night. The clock on her mantel marked the slow, patient passage of hours, and outside the wind began to rise again, whispering softly against the shutters like a voice too faint to catch. She sat by the fire, the mysterious letter beside her, the ink of those last words. "Leave the dead their secrets, dark and steady as though written yesterday." Whoever had penned it had done so in full control of hand and purpose, not with the trembling of fear, but the confidence of power. That was what unsettled her most. Shortly before dawn, she heard the church bell toll faintly in the mist, and with it came a sudden thought, a small, simple recollection, like a door swinging quietly open in the mind. Margaret Price, long dead, had not been buried in London as most believed. Miss Marple remembered the funeral being held in much Benham, the coffin closed, the service hurried, and it had been Dr. Simmons who had overseen the arrangements. He had told everyone that the sister had died abroad and been brought home for burial. But what if the truth had been less tidy? By morning she was already walking through the damp lanes toward the churchyard. The grass glistened with dew, and the sky was pale with the kind of light that seems to conceal rather than reveal. The caretaker, old Mr. Judd, was tending the graves near the wall, his spade sticking, upright in the soil like a sentry. He touched his cap when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. Looking for someone?" "Yes, Mr. Judd. I wonder if you recall the Price sisters' plot. Lillian and Margaret." He frowned thoughtfully. "Aye, though only one's down there proper. Doctor brought a sealed coffin, said t'other had passed in Paris. Never saw the body myself. Too heavy a box for one woman, I remember that." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the name carved faintly in the stone. Margaret Price, beloved sister. The letters were shallow, as if cut in haste. She traced them gently with her gloved fingers. "Tell me, Mr. Judd," she said softly, "has anyone ever placed flowers here?" He shook his head. "Not once, ma'am. Forgotten long ago." She thanked him, then turned back toward the village, her mind threading quietly through the implications. A sealed coffin, a hurried burial, a doctor's word accepted without question, and now letters appearing in the hand of a woman supposedly beneath this very soil. That afternoon Inspector Cray arrived again, looking pale and unsteady. "There's been a development," he said. "The maid's gone missing. Elsie vanished sometime in the night. Her aunt woke to find the bed empty, lamp still burning." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "She won't have gone far. Fear sends people only as far as their courage allows." "You think she's hiding?" "I think she's been silenced, or frightened into silence, and whoever did it knows that she carried the last letter to me." Cray's face tightened. "You believe it's connected to the doctor still?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice low but certain. "But not by guilt, by partnership." The inspector looked at her blankly. "Dr. Simmons," she continued, "helped Lillian Price conceal a crime years ago, one that bound them together. Margaret never died in Paris. She died here, at Rosewood Cottage, and Lillian's terror these past weeks began when someone reminded her of it. That someone sent the coin, a symbol of debt unpaid." Cray took a step back, shaking his head. "You're saying they covered up a murder?" "I'm saying," she replied, "that someone who knows they did has decided to make the past speak again." Just then a constable appeared at the open door, hat in hand. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "we've found something by the mill pond. It's the maid, alive, sir, but near frozen. Keeps saying the doctor's ghost came for her." Miss Marple's eyes lifted sharply. "Not a ghost," she said, rising from her chair. "A woman in the doctor's coat." The inspector stared. "A woman?" "Yes," she murmured, reaching for her shawl. "The one person who knew enough to mimic both men and memories. It's time we paid a visit to Rosewood once more." Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and the echo of distant bells. Somewhere in the hush between, their tolls, Miss Marple felt it again, that faint, deliberate rhythm beneath the silence, the sound of a truth waiting to be found. The lane to Rosewood Cottage was slick with rain, the puddles gleaming faintly in the dim light of late afternoon. Inspector Cray walked ahead with heavy steps, his lantern swaying, while Miss Marple followed a few paces behind, her eyes alert to every shadow that moved along the hedgerows. There was no need for haste. Whatever waited for them inside would not run. The guilty rarely did when they believed their story already complete. The door was unlatched. Cray pushed it open with his gloved hand, the hinges giving a long, low creak that seemed to hang in the air. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender and something less pleasant, mold or perhaps decay. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The fire had long gone out. On the mantel stood a small framed photograph, newly dusted. Two women, unmistakably sisters, Lillian and Margaret Price. Both smiling, but the smiles did not match the eyes. Miss Marple stepped closer. "The doctor kept this," she murmured. "Not Lillian. He must have taken it when she died." Cray frowned. "Why would he?" "To remind himself what he'd done," she said softly. "Or perhaps what he'd saved." From the corner of the room came a sound, a faint rustle. Cray spun toward it, but Miss Marple merely tilted her head. "Not a ghost, Inspector. Only someone who's grown used to hiding." Out of the shadows by the stairs came a figure, hunched and trembling, her face pale beneath the grey of her hair. It was Mrs. Finch, the postmistress. Her hands were ink-stained, her eyes wild with exhaustion. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said gently, "you've had quite a burden, haven't you?" The woman's voice cracked. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I only wanted what was fair." Cray took a step forward, his tone hard. "You'd best explain that, madam." She sank into the nearest chair, clutching her shawl like armor. "It started years ago. I was Margaret Price's friend, her only one, really. When she came to me, she was frightened, said she'd discovered something about her sister and the doctor. Money gone missing, records changed at the surgery. She was going to tell the police, but she never did. The next morning, she was dead." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes softened with something close to sorrow. "And Lillian said she died abroad." Mrs. Finch nodded, tears cutting pale lines down her cheeks. "They came to me together, Lillian and the doctor. They said Margaret had taken her own life, and they couldn't bear the scandal. They buried her quietly and swore me to silence. I thought it was kindness. Until the doctor began receiving those letters, written in her name. And then I knew someone else knew the truth." Cray's brow furrowed. "But who? Who sent them?" "I did," she whispered. "At first, just to frighten them, to make them remember what they'd done. But Lillian was weak, she couldn't bear it. And then someone else took over." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice barely above a murmur. "Who, Mrs. Finch?" The woman hesitated, eyes darting toward the window as though expecting someone to appear there. "The maid," she breathed. "Elsie. She found the old letters. I think she thought she was helping Margaret's ghost finish what I started." Cray's face went white. "Good Lord. You're saying—" But Miss Marple held up her hand. "No, Inspector. Not Elsie. The letters changed after the doctor died. The phrasing became colder, sharper. Not the work of a frightened girl." She rose, her gaze fixed on the photograph of the two sisters. It was Lillian's writing that mimicked Margaret's, but it was Mrs. Finch's hand that learned to copy it. The postmistress's lips trembled. "I didn't kill them, Miss Marple. I swear it." Miss Marple looked at her with that unyielding gentleness that could pierce more deeply than anger. "No, my dear, you didn't. But you started an echo that never stopped. You wanted guilt to speak, and it did, louder than you imagined. The doctor, perhaps to save himself, poisoned his own fear." Lillian's heart broke under hers. "You didn't strike the blow, Mrs. Finch. You simply rang the first bell." The room was still. Outside, the rain eased into a whisper against the windows. Mrs. Finch's sobs came softly, almost rhythmically, like the tolling of a clock marking the end of something long delayed. Inspector Cray sighed and motioned for the constable waiting at the door. "We'll take her in quietly," he said. "There's no need for the village to know more than it must." When they were gone, Miss Marple stood alone before the hearth. The silence had weight again, but it no longer pressed against her. She looked at the photograph one last time, then turned it face down. "Echoes," she said quietly to the empty room. "They only ever fade when someone listens." And with that, she gathered her shawl about her shoulders and stepped into the damp evening air, the faint scent of lavender still following her like the memory of something forgiven. The next morning broke with a curious quiet. St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale, as though the village itself had been holding its breath through the long night. The mist had lifted, leaving the hedgerows silver with dew, and the air was sharp and clear in that particular way it only ever is after a confession. Yet Miss Marple knew too well that the stillness of aftermath was never peace. It was merely the world pretending it understood what had happened. She sat by her window with her tea, gazing at the narrow path where Inspector Cray had walked Mrs. Finch away only hours before. The village would talk, of course. They always did. But the talk would be softer this time, more uneasy than gleeful. The kind of gossip born not of curiosity, but of fear. Fear of what people might do when guilt grew roots too deep to pull. By mid-morning, Cray himself arrived, looking as though sleep had been a stranger to him. He removed his hat at the door, nodding toward her with an awkward gratitude. "It's over, Miss Marple. The postmistress confessed fully this morning. Said she wrote the first letters to punish Lillian and the doctor for their lies, but swore she never touched either of them." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "And what do you believe, Inspector?" He hesitated. "I believe her. For once, I think guilt alone did the killing." Miss Marple gave a faint smile, though her eyes stayed thoughtful. "Yes, guilt is quite efficient when left unattended. But there's something you should still see, Inspector." She rose and fetched a small envelope from her writing desk. Inside was the final note she had received, the one left on her doorstep with the shilling. She handed it to him, her gaze steady. "This," she said quietly, "was not written by Mrs. Finch. The hand is different, sharper, cleaner. See the slant here, and the pressure on the downward strokes. That is not the hand of a woman overwrought with shame. It belongs to someone younger, more deliberate." Cray studied it, frowning. "You mean Elsie?" Miss Marple nodded. Fear drives strange loyalties. When Mrs. Finch's threats began to frighten her mistress, poor Elsie found herself drawn into the story, half servant, half confessor. She wanted to protect Lillian, and in doing so, she began to believe Margaret's death was justified. So when Mrs. Finch tried to end it, Elsie continued the game. Only she turned it outward, toward me. Perhaps she wished to frighten the truth back into silence, perhaps simply to feel powerful in a world that never saw her. The inspector's face darkened. "She's still at the infirmary, barely coherent." "Then leave her there," Miss Marple said softly. "Let her rest. She's not a danger to anyone now. The echoes will fade once no one listens." Cray exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You have a way of making the worst things sound almost merciful." She smiled faintly. "Oh, I don't make them merciful, Inspector. I only notice when mercy hides among them." He left soon after, the door closing behind him with a muted click. The sound seemed to linger for a moment, then vanish into the hush that filled the room. Miss Marple stood by the window again, looking out toward the church spire that rose pale against the brightening sky. The bell would ring soon, she knew. Another Sunday, another hymn, another lesson about the wages of sin and the promise of forgiveness. Yet it was never the words that mattered most to her. It was the pauses between them, the quiet moments when truth slipped through. She set her empty cup aside and reached for her knitting. The wool was soft between her fingers, familiar and forgiving. As the first stitch formed, she thought again of the coin that had begun it all, how it had rolled through so many hands, carrying with it the weight of secrets no one meant to keep. Outside, children were laughing again, chasing each other along the green. The sound drifted through the open window, light and untroubled. Miss Marple's eyes softened. The world, it seemed, was ready to move on. But as the church bell began to toll, its echo spreading across the village, she paused mid-stitch. For just a heartbeat, she thought she heard another sound beneath it, a faint metallic clink, like a coin spinning once more before it came to rest. Her expression did not change, but her eyes lifted slightly toward the horizon. "No matter how far it rolls," she murmured, "the past always finds its way home." Then, almost tenderly, she returned to her knitting, as though nothing at all had been disturbed. The afternoon light slanted softly through the lace curtains, catching the fine threads of dust that drifted lazily above Miss Marple's writing desk. The village had begun, in its slow and predictable way, to settle back into rhythm. The baker's boy whistled again on his rounds, the post office reopened under temporary care, and the church bell resumed its gentle insistence that all was once more right with the world. But Miss Marple knew better. Peace in St. Mary Mead was never an ending. It was merely an intermission between human follies. She had spent the morning in her garden, pruning the rose bushes with her usual patience, her mind replaying the curious chain of events that had begun with a single coin and ended with 2 graves freshly turned. Yet something within her refused to settle. It was a quiet unease, the kind that hid not in fear but in incompleteness. The story, though tidy enough for the newspapers and the inspector's ledger, had a hollow sound when she turned it over in her thoughts, like a note played on a cracked bell. After luncheon, as she sat with her tea, a shadow fell across the window. A figure stood by the gate, slender, hesitant, familiar. It was Elsie. Miss Marple set down her cup and went to the door. "My dear," she said gently, "you shouldn't be out of bed so soon." The girl looked pale, but clearer now, her eyes no longer wild. She held a folded piece of paper between her fingers, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "I had to bring this, ma'am. I found it this morning, hidden in the lining of Mrs. Finch's apron when they took her things away. I thought you should see it." Miss Marple took the paper carefully, opening it with delicate precision. It was a letter, unfinished, smudged with what looked like tears. The writing, though shaky, was unmistakably Mrs. Finch's. "If anything happens, it wasn't me. I only meant to frighten them, but someone else, someone who knew about Margaret, made it real. She said I'd started it, and she'd finish it. She said the echo belongs to her." Miss Marple's fingers stilled. "She said," she repeated softly, "not he?" Elsie nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am, a woman. Mrs. Finch told me once that she used to see a lady near the churchyard sometimes, just standing there by the Price grave. She thought it was a stranger, but she always wore a veil. Said her voice sounded familiar." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window where the church spire rose pale against the blue. "Familiar voices are the most dangerous, my dear. We tend to believe them even when we shouldn't." She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. "Thank you, Elsie. You've been very brave. Go home now. Rest. You've done your part." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple stood very still, her hands clasped lightly before her. A veil, a grave, a woman claiming ownership of the echo. These details, faint and half forgotten, began to align in her mind like threads drawn taut across a loom. There had been another woman once, quiet, devout, a widow who had come to St. Mary Mead not long after Margaret Price's supposed death. She had rented a small room by the church, helped with flowers for the altar, spoke little but listened well. Mrs. Blythe, her name had been, or so she'd said. Miss Marple fetched her hat and shawl, stepping into the cool evening air. The path to the churchyard was narrow and lined with yew. The world seemed hushed as though listening. When she reached the graves, she saw a figure kneeling by the stone marked Margaret Price. The woman wore a dark coat and a thin black veil, her posture one of reverence or guilt. Miss Marple approached slowly, her cane tapping lightly against the stones. "It's a lovely evening for remembrance," she said softly. The woman turned, startled. Her face was pale, framed by graying curls, but her eyes were steady, too steady. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low voice. "It's finished." "Finished?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "Oh, I don't think so, my dear. You've come here too often for it to be finished. Mrs. Blythe, or should I say, Miss Margaret Price." The woman froze, the faintest gasp escaping her lips. "Yes," Miss Marple continued quietly. "You didn't die abroad at all. Your sister and the doctor hid you away after whatever accident befell you that night. Perhaps it wasn't meant to be a death, only a disappearance. But you lived and watched and waited. And when time gave you back your strength, you decided to give them back their guilt." Margaret's hands trembled, clutching the headstone as though it might steady her. "They buried me alive in silence," she whispered. "They took my name, my home, my life. I wanted them to feel it, the echo of what they did." "And they did," Miss Marple said softly. "More than you meant them to. You sent the first letter, didn't you? After that, Mrs. Finch took up the role you began, not knowing you were still here. The echo multiplied, until it killed." Tears welled behind the woman's veil. "I never wanted death, only remembrance." Miss Marple's voice was calm, though tinged with quiet pity. "But remembrance, when steeped in vengeance, always kills something, if not the body, then the soul. You've had your justice, Miss Price. Let it end now before it consumes what's left of you." For a long moment, the woman said nothing. Then she rose, her expression hollow, her veil stirring in the evening wind. "Perhaps you're right," she murmured. "Echoes fade when no one listens." Miss Marple watched her walk away down the church path, her figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the deepening dusk. When she returned home, the fire had burned low, and the house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock. She removed the shilling from her desk drawer, holding it once more between her fingers. It gleamed faintly, cold and bright, a perfect circle with no beginning and no end. She set it gently in a small porcelain dish beside the window and smiled faintly to herself. "Every echo," she whispered, "returns to the hand that cast it." Then, as the clock struck 8, she extinguished the lamp, and St. Mary Mead settled once more into its uneasy peace. That night, the wind rose again over St. Mary Mead, whispering through the chimneys and bending the tall elms along the lane. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire, her knitting resting idle on her lap. She had thought the story ended, yet her thoughts would not let her sleep. There was something faintly wrong about the quiet that followed Margaret Price's departure. Too sudden, too complete, as though a curtain had dropped before the final act was truly done. She rose and crossed to the window. The moon had broken through the clouds, laying a silver path across the green. The church tower stood dark and solemn, but the faintest flicker of light glimmered from the far end of the lane. From Rosewood Cottage. She frowned. No one had lived there since the investigation ended. The constable had sealed it 2 days prior. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter and lit her lantern. At her age, most would have dismissed such a thing as imagination, but she had learned long ago that evil seldom slept when polite society did. Her steps were steady as she followed the winding path toward the cottage, the wind pressing soft against her back like an unseen guide. The front gate was ajar. She pushed it open gently, the hinges sighing in protest. The light she had seen came from a single candle burning on the windowsill inside. The door was unlatched again, just as it had been on the night Mrs. Finch was found. She entered quietly, her lantern beam sweeping across the familiar little parlor. The air was colder now, carrying a faint smell of earth and damp cloth. And then she saw it. On the table, beside the candle, another coin. A shilling. Clean, bright, unmistakable. For a moment she simply looked at it, her face calm though her pulse quickened. Then she heard the sound. A footstep upstairs, slow and deliberate. Miss Marple moved closer to the stairs, her lantern trembling slightly in her grasp. "You can come down," she said softly, her voice calm but sure. "There's no need to hide." A shadow shifted at the landing, and then a woman descended, the hem of her dress brushing the steps. The veil was gone now, revealing a pale, lined face. Margaret Price. But she looked different. Her calm from earlier had shattered. Her eyes gleamed feverishly, and her hands trembled as though something inside her had finally come undone. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice low, hoarse. "You should have let it sleep." Miss Marple stood still, her expression gentle, almost maternal. "I wanted to be sure you were safe, my dear. You've carried this burden long enough." "Safe?" Margaret gave a strange, brittle laugh. "You think there's safety in truth. They buried me alive in lies, Miss Marple, and now I've buried them back in theirs." Her gaze fell to the coin. "That one was for you. The last echo. You wouldn't stop listening." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "No, I wouldn't. Because beneath all your echoes, there was still a voice that wanted to be forgiven." Margaret's face crumpled, and for a moment she seemed very small, an old woman lost inside her own vengeance. "Forgiven," she whispered. "There's no forgiveness left. Only the sound of it fading." She sank into the chair beside the table, her eyes unfocused. The candlelight trembled over her features, and Miss Marple saw then how fragile she truly was, how the years of hiding had hollowed her into something almost transparent. "I didn't mean to kill them," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible. "Only to remind them. I thought fear would make them tell the truth. But it went further, and I let it." Miss Marple stepped closer, laying a hand on her shoulder. "Guilt never ends where we intend, my dear. It moves through people, the way an echo moves through air, each one changing its sound." For a long moment they sat in silence. The candle sputtered once, then steadied. Outside, the wind softened, the trees falling still. When Miss Marple finally spoke, her tone was quiet but resolute. "You must come with me now. It's time to let the living judge what remains of this story." Margaret looked up at her, eyes wet but calm. "Do you think they'll understand?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They seldom do, but I do, and that may be enough." By dawn, the light in Rosewood Cottage had gone out. When Inspector Cray arrived later that morning, he found Miss Marple waiting at the gate, her shawl pulled tight, her expression composed. "She came of her own accord," she said softly. "There'll be no struggle, no more secrets. It's finished." The inspector nodded gravely, glancing toward the cottage. "Do you think it really is this time?" Miss Marple looked toward the distant church. where the bell began to toll once again. "Echoes fade, Inspector," she said, "but only after someone answers them." Then she turned back toward the village, the faintest trace of weariness in her step, and walked slowly home beneath the morning light that broke cleanly over St. Mary Mead.